festival in Brazil, Rock in Rio Festival in January last year. And then later on in the year we went on and we did a concert in Auckland, New Zealand, and some in Australia and some in Japan.
He was always the quietest member of Queen, while Freddie Mercury commanded the stage. Brian made tour through solos and Roger Taylor thundered on drums. John Deacon stood still, calm, controlled, forgotten by some, underestimated by most. But what if the silence wasn't peace? What if it was protection? From the chaos, from betrayal, from the band he once loved. After decades in the shadows, John Deacon finally opens up, and the truth is nothing like the legend we thought we knew. To the world, Queen was a perfect machine. But behind the scenes, John often felt like the outsider. His bass lines helped shape the band's biggest hits. From Another One Bites the Dust to You're My Best Friend, but he was never truly given a voice. Meetings were held without him. Creative decisions made while he was absent. Freddie and Brian were the stars. John just the engine no one thanked. He pushed on in silence, but resentment grew. His attempts to bring more songs to the table were brushed aside. Arguments turned into cold shoulders. By the late 80s, John had already emotionally checked out long before the public noticed. Freddie's death shattered Queen, but for John it did something worse. It broke whatever was left of his purpose. Freddie had been the only one who truly understood him, who defended his ideas in the studio. With him gone, John was left alone in a band that no longer felt like family. The others carried on. Brian and Roger performed tributes, gave interviews, honored Freddie's name. But John disappeared. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted the truth buried, a truth that he felt had never been fully told. His grief wasn't just for a friend. It was for the band that had betrayed its soul. When Brian and Roger teamed up with Paul Rodgers in the 2000s to tour as Queen, fans were split. But for John Deacon, it felt like a knife to the heart. He saw it as a desecration of everything Queen had ever stood for. Freddie's voice wasn't just irreplaceable. It was sacred. And to see someone else stepping into his shadow felt like watching history be rewritten in front of his eyes. John was livid. Refusing to join was just the beginning. He cut off all contact, isolated himself further. It wasn't just artistic disagreement. It was betrayal. He had stood beside Freddie, believed in preserving what they'd built. But now that legacy was being commercialized, repackaged, sold behind closed doors. Emotions exploded. John accused him of selling out, of dragging Queen's name through the mud. Brian and Roger fired back, saying he was clinging to ghosts frozen in the past. But John saw it differently. He was guarding the grave of something beautiful, and he wasn't about to let anyone dance on it. For the film first, and they dubbed it onto the film. Then when we came to do the album, we actually rearranged a lot of tracks, made them, longer and, wrote more lyrics and tried to make them into fully fledged songs. Before Queen became legends, the band was already a storm brewing behind closed doors. Tension didn't just bubble, it boiled. John, quiet but meticulous, often found himself cornered between Brian's perfectionism and Roger's overpowering personality. Every rehearsal felt like a battlefield where his voice was drowned out, his instincts overlooked. When John brought in songs, they weren't just ideas. They were pieces of his soul. And yet, they were met with mocking glances, half-smiles, or outright dismissal. One particular session turned volcanic when a disagreement over writing credits with Roger spiraled into shouting. John threw down his bass and stormed out, shaking, breathless, furious. The beginning of the end, he would later say with bitterness that never left his voice. He wasn't asking for praise, just recognition. But instead of camaraderie, he found condescension. And nothing stings deeper than being silenced by the very voices that once called you brother. Even as Queen sold in millions, financial tension boiled like a ticking time bomb. John wasn't just cautious. He was consumed by the need for fairness, desperate for a voice in a machine that treated him like background noise. He wanted equal distribution, equal say, but decisions were often made behind his back, as if his loyalty was expendable. One lucrative licensing deal in the mid-90s blindsided him. He learned of it not from his bandmates, but from the press. The betrayal was seismic. He didn't just feel excluded. He felt betrayed by the very people he'd sacrificed everything for. He confronted them, And what followed wasn't a conversation. It was a rupture. Voices exploded. Decades of tension pouring out like poison. Allegiances were tested. Lines were drawn and trust already splintered, shattered like glass. From that moment on, something in John broke. The business behind the music became a battlefield, and the bandmates he once called brothers became strangers in tailored suits. He had walked into Queen with open arms, and now all he could see was a door. Despite refusing to perform, John still shared in the band's royalties. Critics called him a recluse. Others whispered greed. But the truth was more complicated, much darker. John had sunk into a crushing depression. The silence wasn't arrogance. It was a cry for help disguised as withdrawal. He stopped attending meetings, stopped giving interviews. Even his bandmates struggled to reach him. Phone calls ignored, letters unanswered. His world had collapsed into shadows. Fame, once exhilarating, had turned venomous. Every spotlight now felt like interrogation. Every handshake a transaction. And without Freddie, the music fell hollow. John wandered his mansion like a ghost. Silent rooms, drawn curtains, unanswered knocks. Not even the sound of his own bass could pull him back. It wasn't just a break from the band. It was an escape from a life that had broken him. There was a night, never mentioned in interviews, never printed in liner notes, when John nearly vanished for good. A sterile hotel room in Tokyo. The band had just finished a thunderous show, thousands of fans screaming their names, but the only sound John heard was the blood pounding in his ears. He sat on the edge of his bed, trembling, staring blankly at the hotel phone. His suitcase was packed, his passport in his pocket. No note, no message, just silence and a growing ache in his chest that felt like the walls were closing in. The lights, the pressure, the alienation. It had all become a prison. He didn't want the riches. He didn't want the crowds. He just wanted peace. In that moment, Queen didn't feel like a brotherhood. It felt like a machine grinding him down. A machine he no longer wanted to be a part of. His hands hovered over the phone, seconds from calling for a taxi that would take him straight to the airport and out of the band forever. But then the phone rang. It was Freddie. Somehow Freddie had felt the shift. "Don't do anything stupid," he said gently. His voice wasn't commanding. It was pleading. That single conversation dragged John back from the brink. But something in him broke that night. Not just a piece, but an entire part of soul. The man who returned to the stage the next day looked the same, played the same, but inside he had already begun to disappear. Years later, as Queen began publicly discussing collaborations with new singers and floated bold ideas about reviving the band's legacy, they extended one last olive branch to John Deacon, a formal letter, typed, signed, carefully worded, an invitation to rejoin, to reunite, to resurrect what once was. But the silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was thunderous. John didn't just decline. He refused to acknowledge it entirely. No call, no message, no closure. Friends close to him recall the moment vividly. He stared at the letter for hours, eyes hollow, unmoving, and then, without a word, he tore it in half. Some say he watched the pieces burn in his fireplace like funeral ash. Others say he wept in silence before doing it. Either way, one thing was certain. The man who once stood behind Queen's heartbeat had no intention of helping them resurrect a corpse. To John, Queen without Freddie was a farce, a betrayal too vile to name. The idea of someone else fronting the band wasn't just offensive. It was sacrilegious. Every attempt to bring him back only deepened the chasm. And that final offer, it wasn't reconciliation. It was salt poured into a wound that had never healed. This wasn't bitterness. It was pain turned to principle. Fury sharpened into silence. And in refusing to answer, John delivered the loudest scream of his life. Today, John Deacon is both legend and mystery. Fans praise his genius. Critics question his retreat. But in the rare moments when he speaks, one thing is clear. His silence was never weakness. It was a scream no one listened to, a desperate echo that went unheard in rooms filled with applause. He wasn't just a quiet one. He was the one who saw it all. The glances behind his back, the choices made without him, the betrayal dressed up as business. He was a ghost in the room, watching the band become something he no longer recognized. He carried the weight of a band fractured from within, and when that weight became unbearable, he didn't just retreat. He vanished, not out of cowardice, but because his soul had been bruised too many times to keep playing along. And when the truth got too loud, when it threatened to poison what little peace he had left, John didn't argue. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. He walked away from the fame, away from the lies, away from the machine that once called itself Queen. He chose silence, not as a retreat, but as a final thunderous refusal to compromise the last pieces of himself. Because sometimes the real story isn't told by the one shouting. It's carved into the silence of the one who finally had enough and decided that the only way to be heard was to say nothing at all. John Deacon didn't fade away. He made a choice to preserve his truth, even if it meant being erased from the picture. And in that absence, in that quiet rebellion, he left behind a legacy more powerful than any encore. The sound of a man who walked away before the music destroyed.